This is the second part of the paper on terrorism that I read in Indonesia, and it's concerning Aristotle's personal, social, and political virtues. So I'm going to start this section of the paper with practical wisdom. I'm going to leave off where I left off. I got cut off. So finish with practical wisdom, and then I'm going to move to theoretical wisdom, which includes speculation about God. And then I'm going to focus on Indonesia's Pancasila, their political philosophy, and finally the 5 pillars of Islam, and link that all with terrorism. Another character trait related to practical wisdom is the power of good judgment, by which Aristotle means the ability to have good opinions when discussing the choices and lives of other people. This kind of reflection is important. Discussing with friends and fellow citizens how people in the past or present have lived their lives, which lives were better or worse, and why, which choices were better or worse, and why, is an important way to learn how to live. Such dialogues prepare a person for the choices they will have to make. Such dialogues give people ideas for how to reflect upon what they've done in the past. Perhaps above all else, talking about the human condition should make it clear to everyone that every citizen needs to become informed about public life, to find their talents, cultivate them, and use them to promote the common good. Every citizen needs to recognize that he or she must reject corruption, using their wealth or power to amass more, rather than to promote collective well-being. Citizens must recognize their responsibility to perform their professional duties well. Their fellow citizens depend on them, pay them, and trust them to do so. A study of the past should make clear that when too many citizens are concerned only for their own welfare, at the expense of everyone else, a society falls apart. Everyone loses in the end. Aristotle's discussion of tragedy also makes clear that human choices are all made in the name of some good. In some cases, people's understanding of their goals might be corrupt. That is, they deliberately seek power, money, status, security at the expense of others. In other cases, people think they are doing what is just and good, but they're wrong. They do not live examined lives. They do not think enough about what they're doing. They give in to an irrational, impulsive emotion, or they do not find out the facts before acting, or they try to satisfy one person at the greater expense of many others, etc., etc. Watching the tragedies and then talking about them with fellow citizens helps people develop good judgment. Audiences can recognize analogous situations in their own lives and the lives of people they know, and realize that what they did was wrong, why it was wrong, and what they should have done. They become better prepared to avoid the same mistake and to advise others against it. This kind of public education is necessary to preserve a stable society in general, and to give a society the wisdom to be able to contain terrorism in particular. Linking practical wisdom to theoretical wisdom. Aristotle argues for the existence of God in a certain sense of the word, God. He examines the nature of the universe and concludes that the material universe could not exist and could not exist in the ordered way it does unless another kind of being also exists. This God is an ordering force beneath all of reality, leading to the gradual evolution of the universe and eventually of life on Earth. What does this have to do with terrorism, one might ask? This worldview is important because it understands the powers of the human soul as a result of evolution. The universe was intelligible long before a creature evolved that was able to understand its basic principles. Further, our capacity to understand the universe and our place within it means that we can learn from past history. There is an object of thought, named the human condition, that does not change. We can study how human beings have lived in the past. We can understand the natural powers of the human soul and how they ought to relate to each other. We can educate ourselves. We can make analogies between our individual lives, the particular historical and cultural context within which we live, and all other human beings. We can recognize similarities underneath the differences because those similarities exist. All human beings have experienced pleasure and fear, for example, and have had to make decisions about how to respond to it. Reflections on the experiences of other people, even those living long ago and far away, lead to the importance of the values of self-control and courage. Human beings are social and cultural creatures by nature. They need to live in a context of many different kinds of human relationships in order to exercise the powers of soul they were born with. These powers exist potentially because they're based on the human condition. Societies and individuals can be evaluated as better or worse, more just or less just, according to whether they dedicate themselves to developing their own natural powers of soul and form societies that encourage other citizens to do the same. We can develop theories of the best human life, as Aristotle has done, because of the underlying order of the universe. We can study the history of terrorism, broadly defined, and cannot come up with the kinds of ways of addressing the problem I have stated above. My claims are vague, based on patterns, but still important. Given how general and vague they are, it's surprising to realize how much they're ignored. They provide only a basic framework, the necessary preconditions for being able to address the problem of terrorism. Yet societies today that claim to care about the problem and delegate huge sums of money to do so ignore this basic framework. Their efforts will fail or be very inefficient. We can study particular examples of terrorism in history to see if the cultivation of the virtues, as defined above, has usually led to better ways to deal with the problem. Aristotle points out that human affairs are imprecise. Due to circumstances beyond a society's control, even the wisest policies and citizens might be attacked and even destroyed by terrorists. But in general, it is more likely that making choices that follow the patterns of wise actions will maintain and improve the quality of life, and behaving irrational, as defined above, will lead to a society's destruction. Most important from the point of view of a discussion of terrorism today, the application of Aristotle to the issue of terrorism will lead to the conclusion that there's no way anyone can say that God wants them to engage in terrorist activities. This kind of violence always destroys human beings and human society. No God wants human beings to use the name of God to kill innocent people or to undermine social order by attacking without warning while dressed as a civilian. Human beings need social stability to survive. God does not want us to destroy each other and our societies. But again, someone might ask, what makes Aristotle's view authoritative? Why should we pay attention to this view? If my religion is not based on this view of God, I do not have to learn these lessons. Aristotle's view of reality and of God promotes the exercise of human reasoning powers in ways that promote human well-being in every person and society. When some version of the Aristotelian view is accepted, religion can be a force for resisting terrorism, especially terrorism in the name of God. Without a rational universal way of understanding God, the universe, and the human condition, religious belief can be used to motivate people to believe and do anything. Power-hungry religious leaders will use the word God to gain and maintain their power. Power-hungry politicians will use the word God to gain and maintain anti-democratic, authoritarian power over citizens. Greedy economic leaders will use God's blessing to justify their greed and oppression of the poor. The problem of religiously based terrorism cannot be solved without some common vision of the human condition. When some version of Aristotle's view is adopted, belief in God can be a primary motivation for condemning religiously based terrorism and allow people throughout the world to unite with this understanding of their place in the universe and their duty to God, however they understand God, to work together. On Aristotle's view, working together is not only possible, it is necessary in order to live the kind of lives any view of God would want us to live, based on the nature of the universe, or God's creation, and our place within it, given to us by God or just having evolved. Secular humanists, atheists, and non-believers of all sorts can agree that these powers of the human soul exist, and exercising them in the ways I have suggested, and Aristotle suggests, is most likely to lead to containing the problem. If someone wants to ask, but if God wants us to behave this way, then why is evil possible? Why do people do evil, and God allows it? There are many ways to respond to this question. I will give one view based on Aristotle. Aristotle claims that even though we're destined to seek wisdom and will not fulfill our God-given destiny without cultivating the powers of our souls and becoming wise, we're also born ignorant. We have to develop those virtues. Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics defines the human virtues in roughly the order human beings develop those powers. The first virtues are self-control and courage, because from birth we experience pleasure, pain, and fear. Children have to learn from a young age how to control their desires and how to face their fears. The other virtues develop as children move into more and more complex kinds of human relationships, weaving together highly complex cultures, and if they are virtuous, cultures that provide opportunities for exercising many of the powers of soul and form a high quality of life together. Aristotle's lists of virtues and their corresponding vices also implicitly makes clear why people choose and suffer evil. Human beings have to choose whether to be greedy or to live moderately, whether to seek power or use their power to help others, and whether to care about social status or about truth, justice, and virtue. These choices are always with us as part of the human condition, and our ability to reflect on our choices and understand them. In his discussion of tragedy, Poetics, Aristotle also makes clear that the human condition is so complicated that people with good intentions often make mistakes, even very serious ones. In the first sentences of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle claims that all human actions are chosen for the sake of some good. The good is that toward which all things aim. The study of ethical theory is important so that people who want to live well can recognize the patterns of good and evil and make wiser choices. They can also learn from their mistakes. They can learn from others who also see the human condition in this way and are committed to seek wisdom. When one reads Aristotle's description of all the virtues that have to be exercised in order to have a flourishing society, it is clear that many things will go wrong due to ignorance, seeking irrational goals, or mere accident. Some version of this basic worldview is a necessary foundation for understanding and addressing the problem of terrorism. All the major world religions discuss Aristotle's virtues and vices in some context. All the major spiritual leaders, Socrates, Jesus, Muhammad, Buddha, and Confucius among them, exercise these virtues. The followers of these religions study their own religious traditions in order to develop these virtues. Our reason enables us to see the cross-cultural similarities and unchanging conditions within which we live and work out our understanding of our values or our faith. Aristotle's theory simply gives a set of definitions and a worldview that can be, and that has been, used as a way to bridge the gaps between the world's religions. We all know that human beings have lived in different places and different times over the long course of history. Of course they will develop ideas about the higher powers in the universe, because those powers exist and we can recognize that fact. People will also inevitably give these powers different names. Of course they will come up with some versions of the virtues and vices, but will formulate their vision of the best life somewhat differently and have different archetypal models and different historical founders. My suggestions are not an esoteric new recipe for well-being. They're just common sense. In a critical situation, the trouble is, in critical situations, we literally lose our minds. This power of soul we have by nature is ignored, corrupted, or miseducated. Aristotle simply systematizes what we actually experience and do, which is complex because the situations we get into are multifaceted and complex. So if we read Aristotle and see all of his distinctions, we can understand why life is complicated and why we get confused sometimes. Religious terrorism, Pancasila, and Indonesian culture. Indonesians should be particularly open to my claims about Aristotle and the world religions because their founding political document, their political philosophy, presupposes some version of this view. I will now try to show that the 5 principles of Pancasila and the 5 pillars of Islam, understood in the light of Aristotle's list of the natural virtues, can reinforce the kind of culture the founding fathers of Indonesia wanted the citizens to develop. I hope to contribute to the legacy of Indonesia by showing how its founding documents are, indeed, a good starting point for creating and sustaining a democratic society governed by the rule of law rather than by authoritarian leaders. I will show that the foundation of Islam is consistent with Pancasila, as long as Islam is understood in a way that respects other religious traditions. Aristotle's theory provides arguments and definitions that can help Indonesians articulate the kind of approach to religion their founders depended upon, giving them a solid philosophical foundation for the value and application of Pancasila to all aspects of their cultural life. If Indonesians adhere to this philosophical approach, they can unify behind a collective rejection of the legitimacy of any acts of terrorism in the name of God or Islam. They can explain to each other why intolerant Islam is inconsistent with the true spirit of the religion and contradicts the basic tenets of Indonesian culture, social and political. They can demonstrate to the rest of the world that Islam is not an authoritarian and anti-democratic religion. It does not envision God as a tyrant who demands blind anti-intellectual submission and obedience. Islam, instead, has a long tradition of the union of faith and reason, a long intellectual history. Without such a philosophical perspective, citizens in Indonesia or anywhere can be manipulated by rhetoric and fear to accept intolerant Islam in the name of, supposedly, returning to God, or the need for social order, or some other claim made by those who do not accept democracy as the best form of society and the best way to cultivate the powers of soul given to us by God. Indonesians can begin by showing that their founding fathers, most of whom were Muslim, set up their society in a way that demands an ecumenical understanding of Islam. Many Indonesians have been doing this kind of work for decades, through their actions, their reason, the structuring of their educational system, the written word, the arts, and all other social venues for the expression of ideas. I am simply trying to encourage them and to offer Aristotle as a resource to use in explaining the value and meaning of Panchasila and how Muslims can live well as Muslims while also being exemplary Indonesian citizens. Principle number 1, belief in one supreme God. This principle has been interpreted to include Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, and Confucianism. A theory like Aristotle's is necessary to explain how it is possible to believe in God and accept all of these religious traditions. Panchasila, then, represents Indonesia as both a religious nation and as a philosophically minded nation. It requires citizens to become philosophical in their understanding of their religions, to unite their faith with the rational virtues as Aristotle understands them. Panchasila also rejects the Western human rights-based political ideology, especially as it exists in the United States, where religious beliefs and politics are officially entirely separated. For centuries before the founding of the United States, Europeans engaged in many wars that were justified by religious beliefs. The United States founders were determined to structure their society on the basis of religious toleration and a complete separation between religion and politics. Politicians could no longer refer to God to justify their actions. The founders of Indonesia do not think religious belief is a source of animosity and warfare between people. Rather, religion plays a positive role as a way to bind people together. The God described by Panchasila, principle number 1, is a God who wants all human beings to recognize their common humanity, their universal condition, and their need to respect a higher power above humanity. In addressing terrorism, no terrorist acts in the name of any religious tradition are legitimate. Principle number 2, a just and civilized humanity. This principle presents an image of political culture as playing an important role in establishing and nurturing all aspects of social and political life. This is not an authoritarian role, but instead the role of providing citizens the opportunity to develop their God-given powers of soul and to have the freedom to determine their own destinies. The principle assumes that people are social and political by nature, and hence need each other to structure and operate many institutions whose purpose is to promote the humanity of citizens. The Greeks would agree. The founders of the United States disagreed. In addressing terrorism, this principle holds that citizens with intolerant beliefs will have access to the goods and services and the same rights as citizens who practice tolerance, as long as those who are intolerant in their beliefs do not act on the basis of these beliefs. This kind of effort to reach out to those who reject religious toleration ought to lead eventually to the assimilation of extremists into mainstream society. As long as their well-being depends on being provided with what they need to flourish, over time they ought to prefer peace to war, friendship to animosity, stability to instability. Principle number 3, Indonesian unity. This principle advocates a common effort to build bonds of trust and goodwill between citizens, even though Indonesian citizens are extremely different in their cultures and ways of living. This principle presents an image of a truly pluralistic society, a society that both celebrates differences and also unites under a belief in an inclusive view of God. The image of God, then, is an image of a God that celebrates pluralism and does not demand that all people worship in the same way with the same words. Since the world's religions are global, people who belong to the different religions in principle number 1 live all over the world. They live in different nation states. If religion is a binding force, it should unite people all over the world and prevent and condemn nation states that try to generate animosity based on religion. In addressing terrorism, this principle requires that nation states work together to find and isolate terrorists apart from any religious association with such behavior. Instead of generating animosity toward the Indonesian state because its citizens are Muslims, Indonesia presents a model where very pious Muslims have a deep commitment to democracy, to condemning terrorism, and to working with people from all faith traditions to address the problem. Principle number 4. A people's democracy led by wisdom through deliberation and representation. This principle presents a vision of how to solve political problems. People gather together around a table and present their different perspectives. They may disagree, or they may simply add to the overall understanding of the problem by bringing their expertise and their sector of society into the conversation. Decisions are made with the most possible agreement between those involved. Decisions might involve a lot of compromise, but that is the model. Coming to an agreement everyone's willing to act upon once the collective choice is made. This model is also very Greek. Unlike the Greeks and Panchasila, the ideology of human rights begins with a set of political principles. The society has to be organized to follow those principles. There might be a debate about what kind of organization would be best, given those principles, but the principles, the concepts of human rights, governs the debate. The Indonesian model is one of conversation between citizens seeking to make the best decisions in particular situations. It presents a model of mutual cooperation and common purpose, not the desire to protect the so-called individual rights of citizens. This kind of cooperation is presented as the way God wants us to reflect on our problems and all the issues that arise because of the condition we were born into. Principle number 5. Just with number 4, Americans sometimes think the only way to do politics is to protect individual rights, and the Greeks didn't think so, and the Indonesians are more like the Greeks, and I think Americans, Westerners, could use a little bit of reflection and be a little more open-minded. And the notion of individual rights can turn into citizens that are self-absorbed and selfish, self-interested, rather than cooperative and social, recognize their interdependence. Principle number 5. Justice for all Indonesian people. This principle represents the next step in Aristotle's theory of deliberation. After every voice has been heard, the object of wish is made clear, the options have been presented, the group has collectively selected one option as the object of choice and has articulated the reason. Everyone must leave the table and go do what they have decided is best. Citizens cannot claim to believe in God and to care about each other without also acting on those emotions and beliefs and actually establishing institutions that fulfill those goals. Citizens must manage their institutions and perform their jobs in the way that promotes the development of all citizens. The authority of every citizen in the various roles they have as parents, teachers, workers, and citizens has to be exercised for the well-being of those over whom they have it in every choice they make. This principle points to the social justice branches of every religious tradition. All the major religions have a tradition of theologians working out the belief system, using the powers of reason. 4 of the 5 religious traditions in Panchasila, not Confucianism as far as I know, have a mystic tradition, a school of religious meditative practice, beyond or outside of reason, as the path to God. Every major religion has a system of rituals and rites, using the powers of human creativity in the arts, including architecture, sculpture, music, painting, poetry, and all the other arts that use human sensuality to direct people toward the existence of God. Every major religion also includes an activist tradition, a history of people acting on the basis of their religious belief to make their societies better. Because religious traditions tend to focus on those aspects of human life that do not change over time, as I have discussed, religion tends to have a conservative influence on a society. But also because of this tendency, the history of people criticizing their government and some of their cultural habits and customs in the name of God can be the best way to bring about social and political improvements. In order to flourish, societies have to constantly change and adapt to external and internal circumstances. No generation can or should blindly imitate what their parents did or try to raise their children to live the same lives they lived. Cultures change. When the change is for the right reason and in the right way, they evolve and become better. It's difficult to bring about social change without also causing social instability. Instability, in turn, can lead to a conservative reaction and a more authoritarian society. The great religiously based movements for social change have passed down a model to posterity of why religious believers should always use their understanding of God to criticize their leaders. Religiously based movements for greater social justice should always be nonviolent. Demonstrators should not resist arrest, even if the arrest is unjust, but should use their arrest as a way to expose to the public injustices that need to be changed. Religiously based terrorism is a perversion of this tradition because it uses the word God to act violently and to deliberately set up a situation of instability so that the people will accept an authoritarian ruler who claims to be acting in the name of God. Panchasila exposes such movements as contrary to the underlying spirit of every major religious tradition. Further, Indonesians should engage in nonviolent demonstrations whenever necessary. Indonesians should understand these ways of expressing outrage at injustices as the only way to preserve a democratic, non-authoritarian society. Indonesian political philosophy assumes that the only way for citizens to truly live out their faith is by living in a society where they have the opportunity to develop and the freedom to make choices that will enhance their personal and social well-being. Social activism is one part of taking the responsibility of a citizen in a democratic society and also, according to Panchasila, the only way to live out one's faith. A few examples from the 20th century of religious-based social justice movements are the civil rights movement led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the United States and the movement for independence from Britain led by Gandhi. Unfortunately, Indonesians had to fight violently for their independence, but now that they have it, they must advocate nonviolent ways of solving problems. They do not want a revolution, but they should expect that there will always be problems that require change and demonstrations to bring that change about. Questioning one's political rulers should not be understood as either anti-patriotic or anti-religious. Rather, it's an important part of loving one's country and one's God. Citizens need to keep themselves informed about social and political circumstances. They must avoid apathy at one extreme or getting swept up in movements that do not promote social justice. Such movements might be organized by people with good intentions who have the wrong ideas, or by people with the wrong goals. Even when a society's social structures and institutions do not change, the spirit of any nation can change from promoting intellectual and political freedom to exercising a great deal of authority. Conscientious citizens need to stay alert to the national spirit. Indonesians have to always monitor the strength of Islamic terrorist movements, both the foreigners who come to Indonesia to incite violence and the number of Indonesians who follow them, and the number of Indonesian terrorists who are native Indonesians. Finally, I will argue that the 5 pillars of Islam, as they have to be understood by Indonesians who embrace Pancasila, their nation's political philosophy, are compatible. That the principles of Pancasila and the principles of Islam are compatible with Aristotle's virtues. The 5 pillars of Islam reinforce Pancasila, leading to a citizenry that will support and defend the stability and well-being of their nation. Islam is not a threat to Indonesian democracy. It demands of its followers that they exercise the very virtues Aristotle claimed were most important for social and political well-being. Once again, religion and philosophy are united. Pillar number 1, Shahada, testifying to God's oneness. The declaration there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his prophet. Within the context of Pancasila, this pillar is a religious statement much like the claims of the other major religions. As long as Muslims agree that they can believe this without forcing anyone else to do so, there should be no problem with intolerance. A philosophical perspective gives a foundation for why human beings have believed in God from earliest times, why such belief is natural. Given this foundation, it makes no sense to think one particular way of formulating this belief is better than another. Rather, philosophy makes clear that it is the particular circumstances of our lives that make us ignorant of any other religion or culture, so we fall in love with the only point of view we know. The complex system of international travel and communication today, however, allows people to recognize the limitations of their own upbringing. When we become adults and re-examine all aspects of our lives on the basis of the universal perspective of philosophy, we ought to tolerate other religious traditions. Principle number 2, prayer. This principle can be viewed as very philosophical also. When philosophy is understood as the love of wisdom, it consists of the activity of examining one's life continually to make sure one has the right goals and is making the right choices. Aristotle spends a large portion of his Nicomachean Ethics discussing friendships because he thinks the kinds of conversations we have with our best friends are the way we learn how to live wisely. These conversations require reflections upon one's life, on others, and on one's society as a whole. Socrates says, an unexamined life is not worth living. Plato's dialogues show him reflecting on what other people say and taking time to engage in his own process of reflection. Every major religious tradition, even Confucianism, includes this kind of reflection. Confucius does not call this activity prayer, but he does say that every day he takes time to reflect on what he's done and whether it was best. The habit of reflection, or prayer, trains believers to use their minds, their reflective powers, as the guide for their lives. We honor God by developing the habit of thinking before acting and acting on the basis of thought. Again, religion and philosophy are united. Terrorism is a rejection of this kind of self-examination and examination of others. It replaces thoughtful conversation with thoughtless violence. Principle number 3, giving charity, and principle number 4, fasting. I've listed these together because they're so consistent with Aristotle's philosophy. Aristotle claims that the two most important virtues for social and political well-being are generosity and self-control. These are exactly the two virtues Islam includes in its 5 pillars. Charity is important because it cultivates the habit of being virtuous and avoiding greed. The nature of desire is infinite, said Aristotle. If we do not limit our material desires, they will simply get stronger. Greed creates instability because it sets the rich against the poor and shrinks the middle class. Generosity, on the other hand, promotes mutual trust and goodwill. A nation that wants to have a flourishing democracy, that wants to give its citizens stability and a lot of freedom to govern themselves, has to promote private generosity. Helping others is an important way to prevent instability and the rise of a more authoritarian ruler. Citizens in a democracy ought to understand that they need to choose to be generous in order to preserve their free and open society. If they are not generous, they will lose various degrees of freedom and choice. The other pillar, fasting, trains citizens to have control over their immediate pleasures, especially the pleasures related to eating. The need to eat is with us at all times. If we do not control it, it will control us. Acting impulsively in relation to eating sets a pattern of acting impulsively in relation to other pleasures. Fasting sets the model of learning to control all our impulses, learning to live an examined life. Once again, reason and religion are united. What God wants from us is also what we need to do to govern our lives by the power of our minds, given to us by a God that created a universe we could understand, or the power of mind simply as the result of evolution. God gave us the power to recognize the way of living that would lead to personal, social, and political flourishing, the way of living God would intend for us. All the major religious traditions condone the values of self-control and generosity, and condemn impulsiveness and greed. Aristotle gives the reasons based on the human condition. Once again, Islam is seen as a religious tradition that unites reason and faith. Terrorist acts in the name of Islam simply do not represent the tradition. Claiming that only Islam provides a model for how to live the way God wants us to live is inconsistent with the spirit of Islam. Pillar number 5, pilgrimage to Mecca. This pillar could lead either direction, but I think the positive consequences outweigh the possible negative ones. Certainly Indonesians could be claiming to be on a pilgrimage and meet extremist Muslims in Mecca and form a network to improve their terrorist activities. If Indonesia is going to be a democratic society, however, leaders cannot forbid citizens from going. Indonesians just have to do what they can to offer all citizens opportunities for a quality of life they will never have if they join a terrorist group. On the other hand, by going to Mecca, Indonesians could learn so much about how their religion is practiced elsewhere. They could demonstrate to Muslims in the rest of the world that it is both possible and even necessary to be committed to democracy if one wants to live according to the true spirit of Islam. Indonesians would have opportunities to share their stories and to listen to others, to explain Pancasila and other aspects of their society. They could hear the stories of others, Muslims from Turkey, Egypt, Tunisia, and many other nations. In this time of great cultural creativity, Muslims in different nations are creating nation states and writing constitutions that combine a predominantly Muslim population with a democratically structured society. Each nation state will have to work out its own position based on its history and culture. Pancasila is clearly connected to Indonesia's own history and culture. Indonesians would have much to teach and much to learn. The pilgrimage would provide a great opportunity to participate in the development of international democracy as it is unfolding throughout the world. Democracy, however, is far from inevitable. Human history is not a story of continual development from more authoritarian to less authoritarian societies. The overall trend has been in that direction, but there have been many serious setbacks. More importantly, current global problems, including the proliferation of nuclear weapons and other kinds of weapons of mass destruction, environmental decay, and overpopulation, all could lead to the end of democracy and a new era of authoritarian societies. China might become less authoritarian, or it might remain as it is, or it might become more authoritarian. At the moment, Chinese leaders seem to be doing a good job of distributing the nation's wealth in a way that is increasing the middle class. They are doing it through the use of authoritarian laws and a non-democratic form of government. If people in democratic societies do not choose self-controlled generosity and the exercise of Aristotle's virtue, their freedom of choice will be lost or at least crippled. If Indonesians do not address the issue of terrorism through rational means by behaving in the ways I have suggested, their problem will get worse. At this point in history, Indonesians have a choice. Indonesia's place on the world stage today. The rest of the world needs Indonesia to set a model of a democratic society with a citizenry that is 88% Muslim. Indonesians need to demonstrate not only that these two are compatible, but that democracy is the only way to live out the best Muslim life, one governed by choosing to follow the way of life passed down by Muhammad rather than be forced into it. Indonesians need to demonstrate to the rest of the world that they can contain terror through the use of democratic means and institutions. This paper shows all the things citizens should do in any nation to contain and decrease terrorism. It links these behaviors to religion and the belief in God in some sense. It also explains why Indonesia has a unique and important place in developing the kind of culture their own founding fathers envisioned when they created Pancasila. As an American, I know the deep influence of a political philosophy on the way citizens think and behave. I know my democratic society is based on a very different worldview. I also know that all societies have the same basic challenges and have to solve their problems by exercising the same human virtues. I wish the Indonesians well in their great endeavor to create their particular kind of democratic society.